Thank you very much, President. I would like to thank Cardinal Texton and the Academy of Social Sciences and Science for inviting me to participate in this August meeting. The topic I've chosen to speak to is European colonialism and the roots of the systemic challenges of African states. Because of time constraint, I will read a few pages of what I have prepared and give the outline of the challenges. Just mention them. I think the paper is in the hands of participants. Ladies and gentlemen, in the effort to realize their full potential as sovereign states and deliver the expected dividends of freedom and self-government to their populations, most post-colonial countries of Africa have to find solutions to several inherent systemic challenges. These challenges are generic and go back to the foundational elements of the system of colonial rule that European powers collectively imposed on the African continent in the late 19th century. In this paper, I look at these systemic challenges from two perspectives. In the first section of the paper, I postulate that European colonization of the African continent was a collective strategic project to establish a new model of slavery-based world economy to replace the transatlantic slave trade. And I argue that upon the collapse of colonial rule, European countries created yet another model of world economy that enabled them to continue to exploit the resources of their former colonial dominion. This model has posed a present and persistent challenge to African states in the post-colonial era. And I posit that in the face of the existential threat that climate change and global warming pose to humanity, the world is on the threshold of a new post-fossil fuel technological era in which a new form of global economic system would emerge that gives nations with technological and financial capital in the North control over the destiny of countries in Africa and other parts of the world that have the resources to develop but lack the capital and know-how to develop them. This will bring to Africa a new model of neocolonialism, unless the world community deliberately incorporates principles of equity and justice into securing the interests of African states, in particular, in partnerships for global development across the world. In the second section, I identify and discuss the systemic challenges that African countries face as a result of the way European countries partitioned Africa and instituted colonial rule in their separate territorial domain. Colonialism, European colonial project in Africa, the beginnings and myth of moral justification. In 1884-85, after a series of meetings in Berlin, the powerful countries of Europe formally adopted a common strategic framework for the colonization of Africa. They divided Africa into exclusive territorial possessions and gave themselves unrestricted power to subdue and rule the populations within their territories and freely exploit the natural and mineral resources of their possession. They needed cheap raw materials for the growing industry and protected markets for their merchandise. The framework of imperial jurisdictions that they established would only be modified after the First World War with the redistribution of German colonies among the British, French, Belgium, and Portuguese to constitute the foundations of the sovereign states of Africa today. The Berlin Conference was a watershed in the history of Europe and the African continent. Historians consider it the beginning of the scramble, quote unquote, for Africa. And concurring, Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, the leader of African liberation, wrote, and I quote, The notorious scramble for Africa began in the last quarter of the 19th century. At that time, Great Britain, France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, and Italy embarked on a race for colonies. This is from Africa Must Unite, 1960. However, it is my opinion that the Berlin conferences were the culmination and not the beginning of the scramble for Africa. The scramble for Africa began almost immediately after the abolition of the centuries-old transatlantic slave trade in 1807, if not well before that. As Freund, an important writer on the European colonial venture in Africa, described the process, and I quote, "Within the last quarter of the 19th century, the slow process of European penetration of the African continent gave way to a scramble for colonies that resulted in the partition of all the lands south of the Sahara, apart from the Republic of Liberia and Ethiopia. There was therefore first a slow process of European penetration, which gave way, second, to a scramble for colonies, and third, resulted in the partition of all the lands south of the Sahara. In the Gold Coast, now Ghana, the African theater of the triangular slave trade, these three phases were clear in the early decades of the 19th century. The British sent their first ambassadors to emissary, James Bardish and Tamadipuyi, to Kumasi, the capital of Ashanti Empire, in 1819. Scrambling for territorial possessions and spheres of influence, the British signed a bond in English with mostly illiterate chiefs of the Gold Coast in 1844, and acquired the Danish and Dutch possessions on the Gold Coast in 1850 and 1872, respectively. They went on unilaterally to declare the Gold Coast a British colony in 1874, a decade before the Berlin Agreement on the partition of. Now, other European countries affected by the abolition of the slave trade were engaged in similar ventures in other parts of the slave coast. Mr. President, the significance of the Berlin Conference is, by forging the Berlin Agreement, the European countries ensured that their frenzied and wild rush for territorial possessions and resources in Africa would not result in armed conflict among them. With the agreed framework of territorial boundaries, they made a collective commitment to respect each other's territorial acquisition and enable each country to set about exploiting the resources of their possessions unopposed. In this respect, it is also noteworthy that the Berlin Agreement mandated each country of Europe to take, quote, unquote, effective occupation of its territories by sending administrators to govern them. With these marks of a deliberate collective scheme, I posit that the colonization of Africa might be described as nothing less than a joint European strategy and venture to establish a new form of slave-based global economic system to replace the transatlantic slave trade. And to underscore this, I offer the following as the business model and the comparative advantage that the colonization of Africa had over the Atlantic slave trade for European countries. First, the continent of Africa was close enough to Europe to be physically an extension of Europe. And Nkrumah, in agitating against colonialism, said Africa is not an extension of Europe. Second, the interior of Africa, the dark continent, was accessible from coastal ports, forts, and castles that had served the world trade in slaves. Third, with no vast oceans to traverse, the wealth of Africa could be obtained at far less financial cost, transportation costs, lower risk of loss of vessels and goods, lower risk to life, and for far greater profit than the European far greater profit to the European countries than the triangular slave trade. Fourth, in this business model, Africans will not be captured and sold, shipped abroad and kept alive. Rather, whole communities will be brought under subjugation and forced to work on plantations and in mines of their colonial masters for very little recompense. And they will breed, as Africans do well, to provide the growing markets that the growth of European industries needed. Fifth, it will cost less to maintain peace and order. European powers had operational bases in Africa and could supply their fighting forces with relative ease from Europe. In the Gold Coast, the castles and forts of the Atlantic slave trade would be converted into official seats of colonial government, the civil service administration, the military force, and the courts of law and justice. And sixth, as Alim Mazuri depicted, the continent of Africa lies between the continent of North and South America on the west and the continents of Asia and Australia in the east. And European powers would not have failed to see the strategic significance of the central continent to sustainable global trade. There was a map of the world on the screen. In effect, the European colonial project in Africa gave European countries not only a continent and its people and resources to exploit, but also a staging post to initiate the globalization of European trade and commerce, and of course, European military power. Ladies and gentlemen, aware of the intense and sustained moral condemnation that led to the abolition of the slave trade, European colonizers felt bound to offer some moral justification for the new form of slavery that they were introducing. And this generated a new discourse on world cultures and human progress in European social, political, religious, and particularly intellectual circles. The Berlin Conference agreed on the partition of Africa in 1884. And 1884 was exactly the same year that the Oxford School of Cultural Anthropology was established, with the appointment of Edward Tyler as a leading scholar of this school, as a reader, and soon after, professor of social anthropology. Serving as an instrument of government policy, the development of the discipline of social anthropology at Oxford would be in lockstep the progress of the British colonial project, especially in darkest Africa. The major contribution that Oxford School made to the colonial agenda was to offer those who supported colonialism a moral justification for colonial rule. And the sum of it was that in the interest of global cultural development, the development of all human beings, countries with superior cultures had a moral obligation to dominate countries, peoples of lower culture and help them to develop. Mr. Chairman, I refer to this contrived moral justification for colonialism because it is remarkable how contemporary discourses on human development and global development goals often resonate with some of the moral tenets, quote unquote, of classic colonialism. A, the development of all peoples is the ultimate common good of all humanity. B, some populations are so poor that they can only develop with the help of the wealthier, more advanced countries of the world. C, the transfer of delivery of development aid to a poor country must be predicated on the acceptance of the values, institutions, and management practices of the donor. African liberation birth of neocolonialism. Africans discerned colonial rule for what indeed it was, a new model of slavery. In the Gold Coast, as well as many parts of West Africa, the central axis of the slave trade for the 3rd century, the movement for freedom and independence began as soon as the British declared colonial rule and will prove inexorable. Ghana's accession to sovereignty and self-government would lead to the total liberation of the entire continent of Africa and raise hopes that the peoples of the continent would be able to harness their creative potential and demonstrate that they were more than capable of managing their own affairs. However, just as the collapse of the Atlantic slave trade moved those who profited by it to introduce colonialism into the framework of global economy, so with the collapse of the colonial regime, lead those who benefited from it to create a new form of colonialism. The year Ghana gained full independence, sovereignty, the countries of Europe signed a treaty in Rome to form an economic association of European countries and restructure global economic system. Not only did they seek A, to promote European economic unity, B, to develop the economies of member states into a large common market, C, build a political union of states of Western Europe, conditions which alone would change the architecture of the global economic system. The EEC, here I'm quoting, also sought to establish a single commercial policy towards non-member countries to coordinate transportation systems, agricultural policies, general economic policies, and remove measures restricting free commerce. End of quote. The Treaty of Rome will thus enable European countries to define and control global transportation, agriculture, and economic activity, and thus weaponize technology, industrial power, world trade, and commerce, capital investment, and exploration of natural resources across the world. Within this new framework and dynamic, African countries would own their resources as independent sovereign entities, but to harness their resources to gain the dividends of freedom would require foreign investment, technology transfer, access to global markets, and so forth. And this established what we now call classical neocolonial. At this point, I would take the remaining time to indicate the challenges that became inherent in African countries due to the establishment of colonial rule. One, artificial boundaries that were used by colonial masters to divide Africa created multi-ethnic populations that were conscious of their separate ethnic entities and had no sense of their togetherness. And so, at independence, critical issue was how could African countries hold together? How could they survive as solid corporate entities? For African countries, this is the most important challenge because across countries, how to maintain unity in diversity has become a major issue for African survival. Two, artificial boundaries that divided the continent into colonial territories also divided African community, ethnic community. So you find Swaziland, the people are scattered over 3 different countries. In Ghana, we are surrounded by 3 countries whose people share common boundaries with us, but a lot of them divided by those boundaries. Now, artificial boundaries have created around Africa areas of conflict for Africa. And indeed, wherever you find artificial boundaries, you find what I consider to be a domino effect. Anything that happens in one country, particularly what is bad, is transmitted to other African countries by domino effect. So conflicts don't stay in one place. They multiply and transmit around us. 3, the colonial civil service administration that the colonial powers established had to be adopted by the independent African states at the point of independence. Now, you cannot use the instrument of suppression as instrument of self-rule. So for African states, the major problem of civil administration is to how to convert our civil service into instrument of sovereign administration. Meaning that instead of, I'm concluding, meaning that instead of serving the civil service, serving as an instrument of power for the government, it should be serving in the sovereign state as an instrument of power for civil society. There are 3 or 4 other challenges that are mentioned. But permit me to stop here. Thank you for your attention.